I want you to listen to this sentence from Chief Federal Judge Patrick Schiltz in the state of Minnesota today. He said ICE has likely violated more court orders in January of 2026 than some federal agencies have violated in their entire existence, end quote.
Federal judges in Minnesota are making a stunning claim right now. They say Immigration and Customs Enforcement has defied nearly 100 court orders. 100. Not suggestions, not recommendations, court orders from federal judges. And this is according to Chief Federal Judge Patrick Schiltz, who has conservative legal credentials and was appointed by a Republican president. He's publicly stated that ICE is behaving as if the agency itself is above the law. This isn't happening in some far-off country. This is happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota, right now.
Judge Schiltz wrote that in a court order late this afternoon that canceled a big hearing tomorrow, but definitely made it plain that ICE is on thin ice in his court. Judge Schiltz said in his filing, this month, the court has found ICE has violated 96 court orders in 74 cases.
And Senator Bernie Sanders is calling it a military occupation of an American city. Let me give you the numbers that are shocking federal courtrooms. Between January 20th and 27th, 61 immigrants challenged their detention in Minnesota courts. Federal judges ruled in favor of the immigrants in 60 out of 61 cases. That's a win rate of over 98%. These aren't close calls or complicated legal gray areas.
ICE must get out of Minnesota now. ICE must get out of Maine now. ICE must stop terrorizing the American people. To be clear, Kristi Noem and Stephen Miller must go.
Judges appointed by both Democrats and Republicans are saying ICE has no legal right to hold these people. The only person who stayed detained was the single individual with a criminal history. Everyone else had zero criminal background, zero. So who are these people being detained? According to court filings, they're being picked up in public places based on what they look like, what they sound like, or the type of work they do. There's a name for this operation. Metro Surge. Officials claim it targets violent criminals, but the court records tell a completely different story. The vast majority have no criminal history at all. They're construction workers, restaurant employees, parents picking up their kids from school.
That's what the law says, and that's what our country needs, because unfortunately, they allowed millions of people to come into our country, totally unvetted, totally unchecked. So you ought to ask, did he have the authority to allow millions of people? Did Biden have the authority to do something that's unthinkable, have open borders where millions of people poured into our country, totally unvetted and totally unchecked, just as you would say? And many of those people were criminals. Many of them were from jails and prisons and mental institutions and gang members and drug dealers and very dangerous people. Many were murderers. We have 11,088 that we know of murders they murdered. Of that number, at least half killed more than one person. They're in our country. They're in a location near you. Biden allowed that to happen to our country. And his people that really ran the country. And the person that operated the auto pen, I think we ought to find out who that was, because I guess that was the real president. So when you ask me if we have the authority, did Biden have the authority to allow millions of people to come into our country? Many of these people hardened criminals.
School. Here's where this gets deeply disturbing. A construction worker in Minneapolis had been avoiding public places because he was scared, but he needed to pick up materials from a gas station for work. Just a quick stop. He never came home. His family tried to find him using the ICE detainee locator system. He wasn't there. They called every facility they could think of. Nothing. His daughter told attorneys her family is shattered into little pieces. She said the detention system has become so chaotic and overwhelmed that it's like a black hole. People go in and simply disappear. No record, no location, no way to find them. This isn't one isolated case. Attorneys across Minnesota are reporting the same pattern over and over. Families calling in panic because someone went to buy groceries and hasn't been heard from in days. Former ICE Director Todd Lyons once said he wanted the agency to operate like Amazon in terms of the scale and speed of moving human beings. Think about that comparison. Amazon logistics, but for people. Federal judges are now saying this turn and burn mentality has led to regular due process violations. The system isn't just failing, it's collapsing. Chief Judge Schiltz isn't using careful diplomatic language here. He's saying ICE is acting lawlessly. And he's not alone. Multiple federal judges in Minnesota are making similar statements from the bench. These are career jurists who spent decades upholding the rule of law without making waves or political statements. They don't use dramatic language lightly. But they're sounding the alarm now, because what they're seeing in their courtrooms represents a fundamental breakdown of checks and balances. One branch of government is openly ignoring orders from another branch. That's not a policy disagreement, that's a constitutional crisis. The tension reached a breaking point on January 24th with the death of Alex Preddy. High-ranking officials, including Secretary Kristi Noem and Stephen Miller, labeled him a domestic terrorist. They posted videos and made public statements characterizing him as violent and dangerous. But attorneys for the Preddy family are telling a very different story. According to these attorneys, Preddy was violently assaulted by ICE agents a week before he was killed, despite posing no threat at the time. The administration has pointed to a scuffle from 11 days before his death as justification. But critics argue that nothing that happened over a week earlier could justify what they describe as gunning someone down in the street. The competing narratives around his death have become emblematic of the larger battle over what's actually happening in Minnesota. Senator Bernie Sanders took to the Senate floor and delivered one of the most fiery speeches of his career. He called what's happening in Minneapolis a military occupation. Those are extraordinary words from a United States senator describing federal operations on American soil. Sanders argued that federal agents shooting citizens, breaking down doors without warrants, and sending 5-year-old children to detention centers are actions you see in authoritarian societies, not democracies. He's demanding that not another penny go to ICE or Customs and Border Patrol until there are fundamental reforms and new leadership at the Department of Homeland Security. This isn't just progressives raising concerns. Former Republican gubernatorial candidate Chris Maydell ended his campaign because he said he couldn't defend the party, while United States citizens of color are living in fear and being forced to carry papers to prove their citizenship. When a Republican candidate drops out over immigration enforcement tactics, that tells you something significant is happening beyond normal partisan politics. But Sanders connected this to something even bigger. He argued that the tactics being used in Minnesota are symptoms of what he calls America's transformation into an oligarchy. While 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, Elon Musk now owns more wealth than the bottom 53% of American households combined. The 100 richest people spent $2.6 billion on the 2024 election. Sanders says this has turned the political system into one where billionaires buy politicians who then pass laws that benefit the wealthy while ordinary Americans struggle. The numbers on America's decline are stark. The United States once ranked number 1 in education. Now it ranks 28th in math and 12th in science. On healthcare, 60,000 people die annually because they can't afford to see a doctor, even though America spends twice as much per person on healthcare as other wealthy nations. 20 million households spend over half their income on rent. Sanders argues these aren't random failures. They're the result of a system where concentrated wealth translates directly into political power, and political power protects that concentrated wealth. The situation in Minnesota is forcing uncomfortable questions about power, accountability, and the rule of law. When federal judges say an agency is lawless and a senator calls operations a military occupation, those aren't normal political talking points. Federal judges don't use that kind of language casually. They're describing what they see as a genuine constitutional emergency. Court filings reveal that people with no criminal history are being detained in circumstances that judges across the political spectrum are calling illegal. A man goes to a gas station and disappears into a system where his own family can't locate him. Attorneys are working around the clock filing emergency motions at a pace they've never seen before. The federal court system in Minnesota isn't operating normally. Judges are holding emergency hearings. They're issuing orders that are being ignored. The machinery of justice is grinding but not catching. The Metro Surge operation was publicly described as targeting violent criminals and gang members, but the reality in courtrooms paints a different picture. The overwhelming majority of people being detained have no criminal background. They're being picked up at gas stations, grocery stores, on their way to work. Critics describe this as racial profiling at a massive scale. Supporters say it's necessary enforcement. But federal judges have consistently ruled that regardless of immigration status, the detentions themselves violate due process. This matters because it's not just about immigration policy. It's about whether an executive agency can openly defy judicial orders. The separation of powers exists precisely to prevent any one branch from operating without accountability. When ICE ignores court orders, it's not just an administrative problem. It's challenging the fundamental structure that prevents government overreach. Judge Schiltz specifically said ICE is acting as if the agency itself is the law. That's the language of someone describing authoritarianism, not normal policy disagreements. The Alex Preddy case crystallizes the larger conflict. Was he a dangerous individual who posed a legitimate threat, as officials claim? Or was he targeted improperly and then killed after being assaulted days earlier, as his family's attorneys argue? The facts are disputed. The videos are being interpreted in completely opposite ways. But what's not disputed is that his death has become a rallying point for both sides of this debate. For those defending ICE operations, he represents the dangerous criminals they say they're targeting. For critics, he represents what they see as excessive force against someone who shouldn't have been targeted at all. Senator Sanders didn't just call for policy changes, he called for defunding ICE entirely until there's new leadership and fundamental reforms. That's not a normal political position even for progressives. It represents a view that the agency has become so dysfunctional and lawless that it cannot be fixed through minor adjustments. It needs to be rebuilt from the ground up with different leadership and different operating principles. The economic arguments Sanders made connect immigration enforcement to broader questions about American democracy. He argued that the same forces that concentrate wealth also support aggressive immigration enforcement that targets working-class communities. The billionaires who fund political campaigns benefit from a system that pits working Americans against immigrants rather than questioning why wages haven't kept up with productivity for decades. It's easier to blame immigrants for economic struggles than to address why healthcare costs bankrupt families or why education quality has declined while costs have exploded. Minnesota has become the focal point because the courts there are actively resisting. Judges are issuing orders, they're holding hearings, they're ruling consistently that detentions are illegal, and ICE is continuing operations anyway. This creates a direct confrontation between judicial authority and executive action. In most cases, when a federal judge issues an order, it's followed. The entire system depends on that compliance. But when nearly 100 court orders are defied, as Judge Schiltz claims, the system itself is breaking down. Families in Minnesota are living with fear that isn't abstract. A father leaves to get construction materials and vanishes. A mother drops kids at school and doesn't come back. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're what attorneys are reporting to judges in emergency hearings. The ICE detainee locator system, which is supposed to help families find detained relatives, isn't working. People are being moved so quickly through facilities or processed so poorly that there's no accurate record of where they are. It's the bureaucratic nightmare version of what Judge Schiltz called the Amazon model. Speed prioritized over accuracy, documentation, or basic human rights. This connects to Sanders' broader argument about oligarchy because the same political forces that push for aggressive immigration enforcement also oppose the social programs that would help struggling Americans regardless of immigration status. Universal health care would help everyone. Higher minimum wages would help all workers. Better public schools would help every family. But those policies require challenging concentrated wealth and power. Immigration enforcement provides a politically easier target that doesn't threaten existing power structures. The bipartisan nature of judicial pushback in Minnesota is significant. These aren't just liberal judges making political rulings. Conservative judges appointed by Republican presidents are reaching the same conclusions. When Judge Schiltz, who has conservative legal credentials, says ICE is behaving lawlessly, that should matter to people across the political spectrum. The rule of law isn't a partisan issue. It's the foundation that protects everyone from arbitrary government power. What's happening in Minnesota is either legitimate enforcement against people who shouldn't be in the country, as administration officials argue, or it's an unconstitutional overreach that's devastating families and defying judicial authority, as judges and critics claim. Those are fundamentally incompatible views of reality, and the facts on the ground are disputed enough that both sides can point to evidence supporting their position. But the judicial record is remarkably one-sided. 60 wins out of 61 cases. Judges across the political spectrum reaching the same conclusion. That suggests the legal foundation for these operations is much weaker than officials claim. The calls for defunding ICE represent a view that the agency has become unreformable, that it's not a matter of better training or clearer guidelines. The operating philosophy itself, what Sanders called the Amazon model of speed and scale, is fundamentally incompatible with due process and human rights. You can't move people through a system like packages and also respect their constitutional rights. Those goals are in direct tension. Minnesota courts have become the primary resistance point because judges there are willing to hold emergency hearings and issue orders even knowing those orders might be ignored. In many jurisdictions, judges might be more hesitant to directly confront federal agencies. But Minnesota judges have decided the situation is serious enough that they need to use their authority even if it's not being respected. That's a remarkable position for federal judges to take. It suggests they see the situation as genuinely unprecedented. The economic data Sanders cited paints a picture of a country where the social contract is breaking down. When 60% of people live paycheck to paycheck in the wealthiest nation in human history, something fundamental is broken. When one person owns more wealth than the bottom half of households combined, the concentration of power is reaching levels incompatible with democratic governance. When people die because they can't afford healthcare despite the country spending more per capita than anywhere else, the system is failing its basic purpose. These economic failures create the conditions where aggressive immigration enforcement becomes politically popular. When people are struggling economically, they look for explanations. Blaming immigrants is easier than confronting systemic issues like wage stagnation, healthcare costs, or housing affordability. Immigration enforcement provides visible action that looks like it's addressing problems, even if it's targeting the wrong causes. The situation in Minnesota is forcing a confrontation that's been building for years. How much power do executive agencies have? Can they defy court orders if they believe they're following a higher mandate? What happens when judges issue orders that are systematically ignored? These aren't abstract constitutional questions anymore. They're playing out in real time with real families torn apart and real judges saying their authority is being disregarded. Let me tell you about another case that shows how deep this goes. A woman in Minneapolis was driving her children to school when she was pulled over. She's a United States citizen, born in Minnesota, but she looks like she might be an immigrant, according to the officers who stopped her. They asked for her papers, not just a driver's license. They wanted proof of citizenship. She had to call her husband to bring her birth certificate to the side of the road while her kids sat in the back seat crying. This is what former Republican candidate Chris Medell was talking about when he ended his campaign. American citizens being forced to carry papers proving they belong in their own country. That's not something that happens in a free society. That's what you see in authoritarian regimes. Attorneys in Minnesota are now advising all their clients, regardless of citizenship status, to carry proof of citizenship at all times. Think about what that means. If you're Latino, if you speak with an accent, if you work in construction or landscaping, you need to carry your birth certificate or passport just to go about your daily life. Because if you don't, you might be detained. And once you're detained, good luck being found in the system. The legal community in Minnesota is overwhelmed. Immigration attorneys are working 18-hour days trying to track down clients who have vanished. They're filing habeas corpus petitions, which are emergency legal filings that demand the government produce a detained person in court. But even when judges grant these petitions, ICE isn't always complying. That's what Judge Schiltz means when he says the agency is defying court orders. It's not that they're appealing decisions they disagree with, they're simply not following orders at all. In one case, a judge ordered ICE to produce a detainee in court within 24 hours. 48 hours later, ICE still hadn't responded. The judge held another emergency hearing. ICE attorneys claimed they couldn't locate the individual, but the person had been in ICE custody the entire time. They just hadn't bothered to transport him to court as ordered. The judge held ICE in contempt. Nothing happened. No one was sanctioned. No one was fired. Operations continued exactly as before. This is what the breakdown of judicial authority looks like in practice. Orders are issued, orders are ignored, and there are no consequences. The detention facilities themselves are reaching crisis levels. They weren't designed to hold this many people. They weren't designed to process people this quickly, and they certainly weren't designed to operate outside normal legal procedures. Reports from inside these facilities describe chaos. People being held in cells designed for half as many detainees, medical care being delayed or denied, no access to attorneys for days or weeks, and the documentation is so poor that facilities themselves sometimes don't know who they're holding. That's how a construction worker can disappear into the system, not because of some elaborate conspiracy, but because the system is being operated at a scale and speed that makes basic record-keeping impossible. Sanders connected all of this to the oligarchy argument for a reason. The same political donors who fund aggressive immigration enforcement also oppose labor protections, healthcare reform, and education funding. It's not a coincidence. Immigration enforcement serves as a distraction from economic policy. When working-class Americans are focused on immigration, they're not focused on why their wages haven't increased in decades. They're not asking why healthcare costs keep rising while insurance companies post record profits. They're not questioning why college costs have increased 8 times faster than wages. Immigration becomes the explanation for economic anxiety, even though the real causes are policy choices that benefit concentrated wealth. Minnesota is important because it's exposing this dynamic. Judges are ruling that detentions are illegal, families are being torn apart, and the economic conditions that make this politically viable are becoming impossible to ignore. Sanders put it bluntly on the Senate floor. He said America is becoming an oligarchy where billionaires control the political system and use that control to enrich themselves further while working Americans struggle. Immigration enforcement fits into that system perfectly. It provides a visible enemy. It looks like action is being taken, and it doesn't threaten the wealth concentration that's actually driving economic inequality. The question Minnesota is forcing is whether this system can be challenged. Courts are trying to push back and being ignored. Senators are demanding reforms and being dismissed. Families are crying out for help and being told it's necessary for security. At what point does resistance become effective? At what point do judicial orders matter again? At what point does the concentration of wealth and power become unsustainable? These are the questions being asked in Minneapolis right now, not in abstract political theory, but in emergency courtrooms where judges are trying to find people who have vanished into detention, in homes where families don't know if their loved ones are alive or where they are, in communities where American citizens are carrying birth certificates because they might be stopped based on how they look. The stakes go beyond immigration policy. This is about whether the constitutional system of checks and balances still functions, whether judicial orders still mean anything, whether concentrated wealth has translated into so much political power that democratic accountability no longer exists. Minnesota has become the testing ground for these questions. And the answers emerging from federal courtrooms there are deeply troubling. Judges are saying executive power is operating without restraint. Orders are being ignored. Due process is being systematically violated. And the people being affected most are those with the least power to resist. That's not a functioning democracy. That's what Sanders calls oligarchy. Rule by the wealthy and powerful without meaningful accountability to courts, voters, or constitutional limits. Whether Minnesota becomes a turning point or just another example of unchecked power depends on what happens next. Will courts find ways to enforce their orders? Will political pressure force reforms? Will public attention create accountability where legal mechanisms have failed? Or will this become the new normal? A system where agencies defy courts, where people disappear into detention, where citizens carry papers to prove they belong, and where it all continues because there's no effective mechanism to stop it. Before we close, one quick clarification. Everything in this video is based on public information, historical context, and my own analysis. It's not a call to action, not an instruction, and not a claim about anyone's intentions. It's simply one perspective on a fast-changing situation. Reasonable people can see the same facts and reach different conclusions, and that's healthy. No matter where you stand, the goal should always be the same: stability, accountability, and peace without fear or hate. You're welcome to share your own perspective in the comments, respectfully and thoughtfully. Thank you for watching and for thinking critically. Subscribe for more calm, fact-driven deep dives.